Get your cheap-ass dress out of my sight. The service entrance is around back, with the rest of the help." The words, sharp and ugly, sliced through the gilded air of the Olympus Room Gala. They weren't whispered. They were announced, a declaration of war disguised as a social correction. Laughter, thin and brittle as spun sugar, immediately followed. It came from a woman who looked like she'd been sculpted from privilege itself. Blair Vanderbilt, 26 years old, heiress to a teetering real estate empire, and currently poured into a crimson dress so tight it was a second skin, glittering with diamonds that caught the light from the crystal chandeliers like captured stars. She stood at the center of a clique of trust fund babies and smirking junior partners, a champagne flute held like a scepter in her perfectly manicured hand. Everywhere, the symphony of the elite faltered. Conversations died mid-sentence. The string quartet's melody wavered, a violin squeaking in surprise. 100 pairs of eyes, belonging to the most powerful people in Chicago, swiveled in unison. They fixed on the target of the insult. At the epicenter of this sudden vicious silence stood a black woman in a simple, unadorned, saffron-colored gown. There were no diamonds gracing her neck, no designer logo on her clutch. Just a dress, tailored with an architect's precision, that seemed to flow around her like liquid sunlight, and her hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate knot at the nape of her neck. She was a slash of vibrant, unapologetic color in a sea of black tuxedos and muted, expensive jewel tones. Her name was Serafina Jones. She was 43 years old, and she did not react, not a twitch, not a flicker of an eyelash. The absolute stillness of her was more unnerving than any scream could ever be. It was a silence so profound, so heavy, it seemed to suck the very air out of the opulent ballroom. She simply held her glass of water, her posture unshakable, as if she were a statue carved from obsidian and dignity. Before we dive into the beautiful, brutal reckoning that's about to unfold, I have to ask, where are you watching this from right now? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments below. And if you have ever, even once, been made to feel like you don't belong, I need you to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. Your story matters, and these stories, our stories, are how we change the world. We're so glad you're here. Now, back to the Olympus Room, where the air is crackling with a storm about to break. Blair Vanderbilt, seeing she hadn't drawn blood, tilted her head, the diamonds in her ears flashing. She raised her voice, performing for the captive audience. "Saffron? Seriously? That's the exact color of the uniforms at the country club my daddy owns. Are you lost, sweetheart?" The smirk on her face spread to her friends like a contagion. A ripple of cruel, practiced amusement washed over their features. It was the casual cruelty of people who had never been told no, who saw the world as their personal playground, and everyone else's props. A few of the older guests, men and women who ran global corporations, shifted uncomfortably. They knew the smell of a bad investment, and this scene was starting to reek of one. But they did nothing. In this world, complicity was a currency, a way of maintaining the fragile social ecosystem. But Serafina, the woman they were all watching, the woman being publicly flayed, remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. Her silence was a vacuum, growing heavier and more potent with every passing second. And that silence was not empty. It was filled with history. It was packed with the echoes of 100 boardrooms, where she had been the only woman, the only person of color, her ideas dismissed until a white man repeated them. It was weighted with the memory of a dozen luxury hotel lobbies where managers had demanded a second, then a third form of ID, their suspicion a palpable thing. It was fortified by every door that had been politely, or not so politely, shut in her face every time she was told she just didn't fit the image. Yet here she was, standing in the very ballroom her company's philanthropic arm had funded the renovation for, watching the tired, old script of arrogance and prejudice play out once again, almost word for word. Her name hadn't been spoken yet. Her power hadn't been revealed. But every second she held her silence, the glittering Gala bent closer to a breaking point. Because in that moment, surrounded by crystal and champagne, by careless cruelty and calculated silence, the stage was no longer theirs. It was hers. And when her voice finally came, Chicago's elite would remember the sound for the rest of their lives. The Olympus Room was on the 95th floor of the Apex Tower, a cathedral of glass and steel that pierced the Chicago skyline. The ballroom was designed to make mortals feel like gods. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city lights glittering below like a fallen constellation. Gold leaf traced the intricate moldings on the ceiling, from which 3 colossal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped with Austrian crystal. A 40-piece orchestra was nestled in an alcove, their music a soft, expensive blanket over the murmur of billion-dollar conversations. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of money, ambition, and $1,000-a-bottle perfume. Serafina Jones moved through this temple of opulence with the unnerving calm of a person walking through her own home. Her name was a quiet legend in certain circles, the kind that didn't make tabloid headlines but caused seismic shifts in the market. At 43, she possessed a strength that wasn't loud but elemental, like gravity. Tonight, her choice of attire was a statement. No glittering necklace to distract, no dramatic train to announce her arrival. Just the saffron dress. Its brutal simplicity was a direct reflection of her core philosophy. Power doesn't need to scream. It needs to endure. Very few people in this room, a room filled with the supposed titans of industry, actually recognized her face. This was by design. Serafina never chased the spotlight. She built the damn thing and aimed it where she pleased. She preferred the quiet authority of signed contracts over the fleeting fame of camera flashes, the solid reality of outcomes over the flimsy illusion of appearances. While others in this room wore their influence like a costume, flashing brand names and inherited jewels, she had always preferred to blend in, to observe, to listen, to test the foundations of the structures she was about to acquire. And this gala, this glittering pinnacle of Chicago's social and financial elite, was the perfect stress test. Hosted annually by the Vanderbilt Foundation, this event was the watering hole for the apex predators of the financial world. Hedge fund managers who could bankrupt a small country with a single keystroke mingled with legacy heirs who'd never worked a day in their lives. Deals were whispered over canapes, alliances forged between sips of champagne. The flick of an eyebrow in this room could signal the rise or fall of a global stock index. But Serafina had walked in completely alone. No entourage, no public relations flack, no husband on her arm to validate her presence. Just her, and her presence, it turned out, was more than enough to provoke both idle curiosity and outright contempt. Her life had been a masterclass in the corrosive power of appearances. She carried the memory of every slight, not as a wound, but as a whetstone. At 27, fresh off her first major success, she'd been denied entry to a private investor's lounge in Geneva. The manager, a man with a thin mustache and thinner patience, had looked at her simple business suit and said, "This lounge has a certain profile to maintain." He hadn't needed to say more. At 33, in a 5-star hotel in Tokyo, the concierge had insisted on seeing a credit card with a limit high enough to cover the suite she'd booked, a demand he made of no one else in the queue. Each insult, each assumption, had been a brick. and with those bricks, she had built an empire. That empire, Athelred Holdings, was a silent behemoth, a multinational private equity firm with a portfolio valued at over $60 billion. It had its fingers in everything from renewable energy tech in Germany to luxury real estate in Dubai, from agricultural innovation in Africa to, most recently, a massive urban renewal project here in Chicago. And tonight, the deal that had been the subject of hushed, excited whispers for months. A $7 billion partnership that would save the Vanderbilt family's flailing real estate company from bankruptcy was set to be finalized. The very deal with the family of the young woman in the crimson dress who had just told her to use the staff entrance. Of course, nobody in the room knew that. Not yet. All they saw was a black woman of indeterminate importance, wearing a dress far too bold for their conservative tastes, walking alone through a sea of diamonds and entitlement. And the conclusion they leapt to, the only conclusion their limited imaginations could conjure, was that she was out of place. The girl in crimson, Blair, had only given voice to the ugly thought slithering through the minds of many. Try the staff entrance. It wasn't just an insult. It was a pathetic attempt to enforce a hierarchy, a desperate reminder of who they believed belonged on the plush carpet and who should be scrubbing the floors beneath it. But Serafina knew. Oh, she knew better. She had seen this play 1,000 times. She knew the characters, the dialogue, the inevitable tragic ending for the antagonists. And so she remained silent. She let the whispers coil and multiply. She let the condescending glances linger. Because every single second they underestimated her was another foot of rope they were gleefully, stupidly handing her. Tonight, the Vanderbilts and their guests thought they were celebrating their own legacy and wealth. But before the last glass of champagne was poured, this gala would become something else entirely. A lesson. The orchestra's violins swelled, a poignant melody trying desperately to smooth over the jagged edges of the moment. But the music was no match for the toxic energy now radiating from Blair Vanderbilt's clique. Leaning closer to her friends, her voice a stage whisper designed to carry, Blair continued her assault. Did you see the fabric? That shade of yellow-orange? It looks like something you'd find on a clearance rack at a discount store. A young man with a weak chin and an expensive watch chuckled into his glass. Or maybe she borrowed it from one of the cleaning ladies. Isn't that thoughtful? The circle erupted in their quiet, practiced laughter. It was the laughter of bullies, a sound that didn't require volume because it thrived on the humiliation of its target. Their eyes, hungry and predatory, flicked back to Serafina. They were waiting for the crack in her composure, for the tears, for the angry outburst that would confirm their prejudices and justify their cruelty. They were waiting for her to become the hysterical black woman of their racist imaginations. Serafina gave them nothing. She calmly adjusted the thin, plain gold belt at her waist, a sliver of metal against the vibrant saffron. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, and then her eyes began to move. She scanned the room, not with panic, but with the cool, appraising gaze of a general surveying a battlefield. Her silence was an act of defiance so profound it began to actively unnerve them. It was a language they didn't understand. Blair, incensed by this lack of a reaction, took a step forward. She physically blocked Serafina's path, her body language radiating an entitlement passed down through generations. Her champagne flute tilted precariously. "You must be lost," she said, her smile a perfect, painted rictus of contempt. "The sponsors' lounge is that way. This section is for the actual partners." The word actual was laced with venom. Whispers now rippled through the wider crowd. Some guests leaned in, their faces masks of morbid curiosity. Others looked away, their averted eyes a form of silent consent. Near the massive, ice-sculptured bar, a pair of junior bankers exchanged a wide-eyed, nervous glance. One of them mouthed to the other, "She's going way too far." Still, Serafina did not move. Her poise wasn't just natural, it was weaponized. It was a shield she had forged in the fires of 1,000 similar, smaller aggressions. This wasn't the Olympus room. It was every room she had ever entered where she had to prove she belonged. The script was always the same. Dismissal first, humiliation second, and then, only after she had weathered their storm, came the grudging, resentful recognition. But Blair Vanderbilt wasn't finished. This was a performance, and she was basking in the spotlight. Her gaze, openly disdainful, traveled from the top of Serafina's tightly coiled bun, down to her unadorned wrists, and finally to the simple, unbranded clutch she held. "No jewelry, no designer tag. No +1," she announced, each observation a public indictment, loud enough for the society photographers circling nearby to hear clearly. "Honey, the interns at my father's company dress better than you do for the holiday party." Her friends, emboldened by the lack of pushback, laughed louder this time. A photographer, smelling blood in the water, angled his lens, and the flashbulb popped, momentarily illuminating Serafina's face in a stark, revealing glare. It was still a mask of impenetrable calm. Steady, unreadable, a warrior's face. From across the room, a young reporter for an online financial journal muttered to his cameraman, "That's Serafina Jones from Ethelred Holdings, isn't it? The quiet giant? Why is she just standing there and taking this?" His cameraman, a grizzled veteran who'd seen his share of corporate takedowns, whispered back, a cynical smile playing on his lips, "Because the story isn't over yet. Keep rolling." The laughter swelled again, a chorus of careless cruelty. Blair, now fully consumed by her own toxic drama, raised her glass like a duelist raising a sword. "Don't you worry," she added, her grin stretching wide. "I'm sure we can find you a proper uniform. Black and white would be much more suitable for you than that awful orange." The orchestra faltered again, a cellist losing his place in the music. A palpable ripple of unease, stronger this time, moved through the crowd. They didn't know who this woman in saffron was yet, but they were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something profoundly ugly. They were about to learn a lesson, because Serafina Jones never fought the first battle of a war. She let her enemies exhaust themselves, let them expose their weaknesses, let them write their own arrogance into the public record. And tonight, the ink was flowing, bold and permanent. The gala had become a stage. And Blair Vanderbilt, drunk on her own perceived power, had just delivered a spectacular opening act. She had no idea that the final act would not belong to her. The acrid sting of the laughter still hung in the air, a foul static charge that made the hairs on your arms stand up. The guests, trapped in this vortex of social horror, shifted in their $1,000 shoes. Many pretended to be engrossed in conversations they weren't having. Others feigned a sudden fascination with the patterns on the marble floor. But everyone was listening. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. They expected anger, shouting, a messy, undignified scene they could later gossip about and dismiss as unprofessional. But Serafina Jones was a master of a different kind of warfare. She gently placed her half-empty glass of water on the tray of a passing waiter, who froze for a second, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sympathy. She adjusted the thin gold belt at her waist and stood her ground, her heels seemingly anchored to the very foundation of the skyscraper. Her expression remained a placid lake, betraying none of the raging currents beneath. Not cold, not angry, not flustered. Simply still. And that stillness, that absolute refusal to participate in their drama on their terms, began to feel like an accusation. It was reflecting their own ugliness back at them, and it was making them profoundly uncomfortable. Blair tilted her head, a predator confused by prey that refused to run. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, pressing against the orchestra's half-hearted notes. Inside that silence, Serafina was not idle. Her mind was a whirlwind of memory and calculation. The images flashed, sharp and vivid. Geneva, 27 years old, standing in a plush, velvet-lined banking lounge as the manager smugly informed her, "This section, madam, is for our premier clients." His eyes had raked over her, silently screaming that she couldn't possibly be one. She remembered the burning shame, the feeling of being an imposter in a world she had earned the right to enter. She remembered Tokyo, 33, watching with a growing, cold fury as 3 European men in front of her were handed their sweet keys with bows and smiles, while she was singled out, subjected to a humiliating interrogation about her ability to pay. And she remembered, most vividly of all, a cold, rainy night in Atlanta when she was 24. She'd been driving all day to a crucial meeting, exhausted, only to be denied a room at a modest hotel because the clerk didn't like the look of her. She'd had to sleep in her car, the rain drumming on the roof like a mocking heartbeat, vowing that she would one day own the building and every building like it, not for revenge, but so that no one else would ever have to feel that specific brand of powerless. And now here it was again. The same script, just with more expensive props. Underneath chandeliers worth more than the entire gross domestic product of a small nation. The message was identical. You do not belong. But Serafina had learned the power of patience. She had built an empire from the silence that others consistently, fatally, mistook for weakness. She understood a fundamental truth that Blair Vanderbilt, in her diamond-encrusted ignorance, never would. Restraint is not surrender. It is strategy. The young waiter who had taken her glass hesitated nearby, caught between his duty to keep moving and the human instinct to witness the unfolding drama. He glanced at Serafina, his expression a silent apology for his proximity to the insult. She met his eyes for a fraction of a second, her gaze calm but firm. The look conveyed a complex message. Do not feel burdened on my behalf. Just watch. Blair, sensing she was losing the crowd, laughed again. This time the sound was brittle, like glass on the verge of shattering. No words, figures, she sneered, turning back to her sycophantic friends. Some people just don't know their place. Still, Serafina said nothing. But in the charged atmosphere of the room, a tectonic shift was occurring. It no longer felt like she was the one being judged. The entire room was. Every second her calm held, the cruelty of Blair and her circle was exposed in sharper, uglier, more undeniable relief. The Gala thought it had cornered a stray lamb for slaughter. They were slowly realizing they might have just cornered a lioness. Serafina had trapped them all without uttering a single syllable, and that silence was about to create an echo that would shake the foundations of their comfortable world. The orchestra, under the frantic direction of its conductor, tried to reclaim the room, sliding into a frantic, almost desperate waltz. But the tension was a physical presence now. It had drowned out the music entirely. The insults hung in the air like cigar smoke, refusing to dissipate. Some guests tried to resume their conversations, to laugh a little too loudly, but the moment was a black hole, sucking all the light and levity out of the room. At the edge of the ballroom, the young journalist clutched his phone, his knuckles white. His press badge swung against the lapel of his rented tuxedo. "This isn't right," he whispered, his voice tight with a mixture of journalistic excitement and genuine disgust. Without waiting for his cameraman, he went live, tapping the button on his streaming app. The small red light blinked on, a silent witness. His phone's camera captured the scene with damning clarity, Blair, leaning in, her face twisted in a smug sneer, her glass raised like a weapon, and the woman in saffron, motionless, dignified, a portrait of unshakable grace under fire. The two junior bankers by the bar were still whispering. One of them finally spoke, his voice low but laced with a dawning sense of conviction. "Why is nobody doing anything? Why is no one stopping this? The woman hasn't said a damn word." His colleague nodded, casting a nervous glance towards Blair's powerful circle. "Because that's how this works, man. The queen bee stings, and the rest of the hive just buzzes along. You make a sound, you get stung next." But the silence of the hive was beginning to crack. At a prominent table near the stage, a woman in her late 50s, a string of heavy, luminous pearls gleaming against her black Dior gown, leaned towards her husband, a man whose name was on a hospital wing. "I don't care who she is," she whispered, her voice sharp. "Nobody deserves that. This is barbaric." Her husband frowned, shifting his considerable weight in his chair. "Careful, darling," he muttered, his eyes flicking nervously towards the Vanderbilts. "You know how they are. You don't want to get on their bad side." But she ignored him. Her own phone slid out of her beaded clutch. With a deft, almost invisible movement, she angled the screen and pressed record. It only took one. Then another guest, a tech investor from the West Coast, lifted his phone. Then another. A quiet, subtle rebellion was spreading. A ripple of tiny red recording lights began to glow across the vast ballroom, like embers catching in a dry forest. Blair noticed. Of course, she noticed. Her smile tightened, the muscles in her jaw flexing. She tossed her long blonde hair, a gesture of practiced nonchalance, but her voice grew louder, sharper, as if she could drown out the silent judgment with sheer volume. "See? Can't even defend herself. That's really all you need to know about people like that." But the crowd's eyes weren't really on her anymore. They were on the still, silent figure in saffron. They were mesmerized by the woman who hadn't flinched, who hadn't fought back, who simply stood with a kind of profound poise that made Blair's viciousness look small, cheap, and pathetic. At the back of the room, near the service doors, a young caterer set down his heavy tray of empty glasses, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was a student, working this gig to pay for his tuition, and he'd seen enough of the casual cruelty of the super-rich to last a lifetime. Not again, he whispered to himself, a hot surge of anger rising in his chest. For a split second, it looked like he might actually step forward, say something, do something. But Serafina's calm, somehow, held him back. It was as if she was communicating to him, and to everyone else, without words. "Don't save me. Witness me." And now, she had her witnesses. The phones kept rising. The whispers kept spreading. Guests who had previously looked away in embarrassment were now leaning in, their faces grim, watching with rapt attention. Something fundamental was shifting. It wasn't loud, it wasn't sudden, but it was as inevitable as the turning of the earth. Blair laughed again, a desperate, brittle sound trying to reclaim the stage. But the sound didn't land. Instead of amusement or agreement, it was met with a wall of silence. Silence, and the quiet, damning clicks of dozens of phones capturing every frame of her self-immolation. Serafina still hadn't spoken a single word. She didn't need to. The room, finally, was beginning to speak for her. The atmosphere in the Olympus room had curdled. Where there had been polite, manufactured laughter, there was now a thick, anxious unease. Where Blair Vanderbilt had expected fawning applause for her social dominance, she found only a chilling silence and the accusatory red glow of 100 recording smartphones. Her jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in her cheek. The smirk remained plastered on her face, but it was a crumbling facade, cracks forming at the corners. She lifted her glass again, her movements becoming jerky, her voice forced into a register of theatrical boredom. "You know what this reminds me of?" she said, her eyes locked on Serafina, her voice pitching to carry over the silent judgment. "That time last year, at the charity auction, a woman tried to sneak into our private investor dinner, had a fake pass, a borrowed dress, thought no one would notice." She paused for dramatic effect. "Security had her out on the street in less than 5 minutes." Her friends laughed on cue, but the sound was hollow, strained. They were starting to look like hostages to her escalating cruelty. Blair took another step closer, invading Serafina's personal space. The scent of her perfume, a cloying, expensive floral, was an assault. She looked Serafina up and down, her eyes narrowing with a theatrical disdain that was beginning to look like desperation. "No jewels? No credentials? No seat at any real table in this city." She let the words hang in the air, a verbal guillotine. Then she delivered what she thought would be the killing blow. "Tell me," she purred, "whose +1 are you?" The crowd stiffened. Even the most jaded, cynical people in the room felt a collective intake of breath. This was a direct challenge to her very existence in their world. Every insult was another log on a pyre, and the whole room was holding its breath, waiting for the match. Serafina didn't move. Her hands remained steady at her sides, her posture as straight and unyielding as the steel girders holding up the tower. But Blair wasn't done. She began to circle Serafina slowly, like a shark. Her crimson dress shimmered under the chandeliers, a beacon of aggression. "Saffron satin, a sad little bun, not even a goddamn necklace," she spat, her voice losing its playful edge and taking on a raw, ugly snarl. "You honestly look like you should be working here. Maybe you're one of the hostesses who wandered too far from her station." A few audible gasps rippled through the room. A man in the corner muttered, "That's enough, Blair. It's too far." His wife quickly hushed him, but the sentiment had been spoken. Blair leaned in, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial hiss, just loud enough for the dozens of nearby phone microphones to pick it up clearly. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her breath hot and smelling of champagne. "And you never, ever will." She straightened up, flashing her practiced, brilliant smile to the surrounding guests, as if she had just delivered the wittiest punchline of the century. Her friends chuckled obediently, raising their glasses in a mock toast. But their laughter no longer filled the room. It was swallowed by the immense, powerful gravity of the silence emanating from Serafina. That silence was no longer a shield. It was a mirror. And it was showing everyone in the room a reflection of themselves they did not want to see. For her entire life, Blair Vanderbilt had survived and thrived on the power of her family name, her looks, and her unchecked, unthinking arrogance. Tonight, she believed, was no different. She thought she was in complete control of the narrative, the director of this little drama of humiliation. But with every spiteful word, every condescending smirk, every careless, cruel gesture, she was meticulously, painstakingly documenting her own spectacular downfall. The gala no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like a tribunal. And Blair Vanderbilt had just delivered a full, uncoerced confession. The orchestra had given up entirely. The musicians sat with their bows resting on their knees, their faces a mixture of astonishment and apprehension. They knew, as everyone now knew, that music could not mask what was about to break. Blair swirled the last of the champagne in her flute, the golden bubbles catching the light like sparks just before an explosion. Her smirk had hardened into something cold and brittle. Desperation was now laced with pure entitlement. Too many cameras were on her. Too many eyes were watching her cruelty. And yet, instead of pulling back from the cliff's edge, she decided to leap. She stepped directly into Seraphina's space, so close that the crimson of her dress was reflected in the saffron satin. Her words were sharp now, stripped of all pretense, like needles dipped in acid. Still nothing? Not one goddamn word? She tilted her head, her blonde curls brushing against her bare shoulder. That's the problem with your kind. You never know when you're not wanted. Gasps, louder this time, rippled through the room. Your kind. The phrase landed with the force of a physical blow. It was deliberate, it was unambiguous, it was ugly. And then came the act that would shatter the night into a million pieces. With a final contemptuous flick of her wrist, Blair tipped her glass forward. A stream of golden champagne arced through the air and splattered onto the gleaming marble floor, directly at Seraphina's feet. Droplets hit the hem of her saffron gown, instantly darkening the fabric, creating a small, ugly stain. The sound was barely audible, just a soft splash and a fizz. But the silence that followed was absolute. It was a deafening, crushing void. Dozens of guests froze mid-breath. The waiters stopped in their tracks, trays of delicate glasses trembling in their hands. A photographer's flash went off at the precise moment the liquid hit the floor. The image of the violation seared into the digital memory of the night. Blair feigned a theatrical innocence, her lips curling into a smug, unapologetic smile. "Oops," she purred, her voice dripping with a saccharine, false sweetness. "Clumsy me. I guess that color stains easily." Her friends laughed again, but this time the sound was fractured, uneasy. It stumbled over the palpable discomfort that had now seized the entire room. A few of them actually took a step back, physically distancing themselves, finally realizing that the cameras were still rolling, that the entire world was watching. Seraphina looked down. For a long, deliberate second, she studied the small, damp patch on her dress. Then, slowly, she lifted her gaze. She didn't look at Blair. She didn't look at the shocked crowd. She looked straight ahead, into the middle distance, as if she were seeing something far beyond the walls of this room. Her posture remained perfect. Her calm was still absolute. But something in the air had changed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 20 degrees. That single, unblinking look seemed to pull the very breath from 100 pairs of lungs. A young banker standing nearby whispered to his colleague, his voice shaking. "She just ended her own career." His colleague shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with a terrible understanding. "No," he breathed. "She just ended her family's." Blair, triumphant in her own deluded mind, twirled the now empty champagne flute between her fingers, blind to the magnitude of what she had just done. She believed she had won. She believed she had completed the humiliation, re-established the social order, put the outsider back in her place. But the humiliation wasn't in the stained saffron dress. It was in the act itself, broadcast live, recorded by 100 witnesses, an act of petty, racist aggression so clear, so undeniable, it would be forever etched into the history of this gilded night. As the champagne stain spread slowly across the pristine marble, so too did the terrifying realization that the gala had finally, irrevocably reached its point of no return. The storm had reached its peak, and what came next would tear the night and the Vanderbilt legacy apart. The champagne still glistened on the marble floor, a golden wound. Blair Vanderbilt twirled her empty glass, her laughter now brittle and defiant, a desperate clinging to the last vestiges of her power. But the room no longer belonged to her. The universe of the Olympus room had contracted to a single point. The woman in the saffron dress. Seraphina Jones straightened her shoulders, a small, almost imperceptible movement that nonetheless seemed to radiate immense power. She didn't shout. She didn't even raise her voice. She simply reached into her simple clutch and drew out her phone. The motion was fluid, economical, as precise as her signature on a multi-billion-dollar contract. One tap of her thumb on the screen. "Activate protocol," she said. Her voice was soft, but it was amplified by a small, nearly invisible microphone clipped to the collar of her dress. The words were not meant for Blair, nor for the crowd. They were a command. Instantly, things began to happen. Across the city, in a sleek, darkened boardroom on the top floor of the Ethelred Holdings Tower, a dozen screens blinked to life. A secure video conference connected, and the faces of her board of directors, titans of global finance from London, Hong Kong, and New York appeared, their expressions grim and attentive. They were seeing and hearing everything. In the corner of the Olympus room, a man who had looked like just another guest in a tuxedo, one of Serafina's senior security and intelligence officers, stood up and began discreetly recording from a second high-definition angle. The live feed from Serafina's own microphone and a hidden body camera was being routed directly to her legal team. Blair blinked, her drunken confidence finally beginning to waver in the face of this strange, calm, technological response. "What's this?" she scoffed, trying to regain control. "Calling for backup?" For the first time since the assault began, Serafina lifted her eyes and locked them directly onto Blair's. They were not angry. They were not hurt. They were cold, clear, and deliberate. They carried the weight of 1,000 battles fought and won in silence. "Record everything," Serafina instructed her team through the microphone, her voice a calm, chilling command that cut through the ballroom's stunned silence. "And connect me to the full board. Live." A calm, male voice spoke directly into her hidden earpiece, audible only to her. "We're live, Madam Jones. Every director is watching. Legal is on the line." A new murmur swept through the crowd. Madam Jones. The name, spoken with such deference, began to spread in urgent, shocked whispers. "Jones? As in Ethelred Holdings Jones?" One banker gasped to his companion. "That's Serafina Jones." Blair's brittle laugh faltered. "What board? The board of the catering company. What are you even pretending to be?" But her words stumbled, tripping over the rising tide of recognition that was now flooding the room. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place in 100 minds at once. They remembered the hushed articles in the Wall Street Journal. They remembered the rumors of a massive, game-changing investment. They remembered the $7 billion deal that was supposed to save the Vanderbilts. And the realization struck them all like a physical blow. The woman they had watched being mocked, humiliated, and assaulted with champagne was not an outsider. She wasn't a party crasher. She was the deal. She was the anchor. She was the financial gravity holding up the entire evening. The phones rose higher. The camera lenses zoomed closer. The crowd instinctively, magnetically, began to shift away from Blair, creating a visible void around her. They moved towards the woman in saffron, who suddenly seemed to stand taller than the colossal chandeliers themselves. Serafina's silence had been her shield. Now her words would be her sword, and with a calmness that was infinitely more terrifying than rage, she prepared to strike. The whispers in the room had morphed from curiosity into a roaring wave of disbelief. Serafina Jones. It can't be. Eyes darted frantically between the stained saffron dress and the now pale face of Blair Vanderbilt, the balance of power in the room tilting so violently it was almost visible. Finally, Serafina Jones lifted her chin. She didn't need to ask for silence. It was offered to her, a complete and total surrender of the room's attention. The hush was so absolute that the fizzing of champagne in a glass 10 feet away sounded like a roar. Even the orchestra had lowered their instruments, sitting as still as statues. She spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it rang with an astonishing clarity, each syllable as clear and hard as a diamond. You just told the founder and CEO of Ethelred Holdings to use the service entrance. She paused, letting the weight of that simple, factual statement crush the remaining arrogance out of Blair Vanderbilt. And, she continued, her voice dropping half an octave, becoming even more resonant, you just poured champagne on the woman who was, until 60 seconds ago, the sole investor behind your family's $7 billion bailout. The words landed like a meteorite. They were a verdict, an execution. Blair Vanderbilt's face, already pale, went completely white. She looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Around her, her circle of friends, the sycophants who had been laughing moments before, began to back away, their faces masks of pure horror. Someone in the back of the room dropped a glass, and the shatter echoed in the dead silence like a gunshot. Serafina let the silence hang for another beat, then continued, her tone becoming sharper, more clinical, like a surgeon making a precise incision. You assumed I was staff. You assumed I was nobody. You assumed you had the right to humiliate me. Her eyes swept the room, meeting the gaze of every person who had watched and done nothing. But it is my signature on the contracts that was set to keep your family's legacy afloat. It is my company's capital that was going to build the very stage you so arrogantly stand on. She brought her gaze back to Blair, pinning her with an intensity that made the younger woman physically flinch. And tonight, in front of this entire room and a global audience online, you have revealed far more about your character than I ever could. Gasps rippled through the ballroom. People were openly staring now, their faces a mixture of shock, fascination, and for many, a creeping, sickening shame. The journalist who was live streaming whispered into his phone, his voice trembling with adrenaline. It's confirmed. It's Serafina Jones. The Serafina Jones. This isn't just a social spat. This is a multi-billion-dollar implosion happening live. His stream's comment section was a waterfall of exploding text, a torrent of disbelief, outrage, and awe. Blair's face flushed a deep, mottled crimson, a shade that clashed horribly with her dress. She finally found her voice, but it was a strangled, pathetic thing. You can't. This is a misunderstanding. But nobody was listening to her. Nobody was on her side anymore. The room had turned. The cameras were relentless. And Serafina's eyes, calm, unwavering, and utterly implacable, held her in place. This gala, Serafina stated, her voice low but carrying with absolute authority across the silent hall, is no longer yours to define. It never was. For a moment, the air itself seemed to solidify. It felt as if the chandeliers, the marble, the orchestra, and every single soul inside the Olympus room were leaning in to absorb the sheer, unadulterated power of those words. And in that crystalline stillness, the transfer of power was complete. Blair Vanderbilt was no longer the center of attention. She was no longer even the villain of the story. She was a footnote. Serafina Jones was the story. And for the first time all evening, the glittering, arrogant world of Chicago's elite finally, truly understood who owned the room. The ovation that followed was not polite. It was not gentle. It began with a single, sharp clap from the back of the room, from the young caterer who had set down his tray. Then another, from the journalist. Then a woman at a front table jumped to her feet, her hands coming together with a resounding crack. And then the dam broke. The sound swelled, a percussive, rolling thunder that shook the crystal on the chandeliers. Bankers, investors, Even rival CEOs were on their feet, their applause a raw, visceral release of the tension that had gripped them. It was applause for the sheer, stunning audacity of the moment, for the spectacle of justice delivered so swiftly and decisively. Serafina Jones did not bow. She did not smile or wave to acknowledge the thunderous applause. Her work here was done. She simply picked up her clutch from the tray where she'd left her water glass an eternity ago and turned towards the grand marble staircase that led to the exit. Her heels clicked against the polished stone with a slow, rhythmic precision. Each step was an exclamation point at the end of a brutal sentence. The cameras followed her every move, the crowd parting before her like the Red Sea. She never once looked back. Behind her, Blair Vanderbilt had collapsed into a nearby chair, a broken doll in a crimson dress. Her empire was not just crumbling, it was being vaporized in real time. The friends who had flanked her moments before had vanished into the crowd, their faces pale with the desperate, selfish need to not be associated with the fallout. The journalist's voice narrated the exodus, his own voice thick with awe. She's just walking away. The deal is dead. The Vanderbilt name is toast. And Serafina Jones? My God, she never even raised her voice. As she reached the massive doors, the young caterer from before rushed to pull one open for her, his eyes shining with a respect that bordered on reverence. Their gazes met for a fleeting second, and in that silent exchange, a powerful lesson was transferred. Real power doesn't need to announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. Sometimes it just waits and watches, and then moves with the devastating, quiet finality of a guillotine. The doors swung open, and the cold, clean air of the Chicago night rushed in, sweeping away the scent of stale champagne and shattered arrogance. Serafina stepped out into the night, her saffron dress catching the glow of the city lights, a beacon of defiant fire against the darkness. Behind her, the Gala was devolving into chaos. Phones were buzzing with calls from panicked brokers. Reputations were being reassessed. The intricate web of social and financial alliances was being frantically rewoven. But none of that could touch her now. She had come here tonight and had been tested. And she had reminded them all of a fundamental truth they had long forgotten. Justice, true justice, doesn't need volume. It just needs a spine of steel. Her driver, already waiting, opened the door to a sleek black sedan. As she was about to get in, Serafina paused for a single moment. She looked back at the glowing apex tower, at the Olympus room blazing with light, a temple of wealth that had just been forced to learn a lesson in worth. Her voice was quiet, a whisper spoken only to herself, but it was the truest statement of the entire night. Power doesn't shout, she said. It endures, and then it acts. And with that, she slipped into the car. The door closed with a soft, decisive click. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, melting into the river of city lights, leaving the chaos of the Gala behind. And in its wake, the world was already telling the story. Not of a humiliation, but of a reckoning. But this was never just about one deal or one insult. As the skyline of Chicago receded in the rearview mirror, Serafina reflected. This was for the girl sleeping in her car in Atlanta, for the young woman being patronized in Geneva, for every person of color, every woman, every outsider who had ever been told, in 1,000 different ways, that they did not belong. The $7 billion was just collateral damage. The real victory was in the quiet, unshakable knowledge of her own worth, a currency that could never be devalued, a power that could never be taken away. That was the empire that truly mattered. And if you've stayed with this story to the very end, it's because a part of you recognizes that truth. If Serafina's story of quiet strength and absolute integrity resonated with you, Make sure you are subscribed to this channel, and please hit that notification bell. We share stories of justice, empowerment, and the enduring power of the human spirit every single week. Thank you for being here. You are the reason we tell these stories. Never let anyone make you feel like you belong at the service entrance. You belong exactly where you stand.